burden of disease. We'll see why. It is associated with significant morbidity and mortality, but it is quite a potentially treatable condition. Okay, so morbidity and mortality is very high when you untreat. So what is the incidence? About 10 million cases occurring every year, and it represents about third leading vascular disease after acute myocardial infarction and stroke, but an underdiagnosed condition. Okay, and incidence is steadily increasing because of the population aging and comorbids such as obesity, heart failure, and cancer. So incidence is higher in black people but lower in Asian people. Okay, and risk does not differ by sex, although it seems to be 2 times higher in men than in women when VTE is related to pregnancy and estrogen therapy are not considered. Okay, so it is 2 times more common in men than in women.
Sir, is the slides being screened, sir?
Oh, I didn't put in screen sharing. Okay,
Yes, sir.
sorry. Okay, 1 second.
Yes, sir. Now it's visible.
Is it visible? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So deep vein thrombosis and pulmonary embolism, they are collectively referred to as venous thromboembolism, and they constitute a major global burden of the disease. And it is usually associated with significant morbidity and mortality, but it is a potentially treatable condition. Now, what is the incidence? Incidence about 10 million cases are occurring every year, and hence it is the third leading vascular disease after an acute myocardial infarction and stroke, but it is usually an underdiagnosed condition. Incidence is steadily increasing because of the population aging, a higher prevalence of comorbids such as obesity, heart failure, and cancer. These three are the most important risk factors for getting pulmonary thromboembolism. Okay. So incidence is higher in black people but lower in Asian people. And risk does not differ by sex, but it seems to be 2 times higher in men than in women. Now, when we consider the etiology, what is the reason for getting this pulmonary thromboembolism or deep vein thrombosis? About one third to one half of the VTE do not have an identifiable episodes, and therefore a provoking factor is classified as unprovoked. So, hypercoagulability, stasis, and vascular wall damage or dysfunction are the triad. This triad is also termed as Virchow's triad. You would have learned in your pathology. So, hypercoagulability, stasis, and vascular wall damage or dysfunction causes the provoking of venous thromboembolism. And about 20% of all venous thromboembolism are cancer related, whereas surgery and immobilization both account for only 15% of cases. So this is what I was talking about. Endothelial injury, abnormal blood flow, and hypercoagulability, all these three things together forms the Virchow's triad. So what are all the risk factors for thromboembolism? When we talk about the acquired factors, any age older than 40 years, a prior history of venous thromboembolism, prior major surgical procedure, any trauma, hip fracture, venous stasis or varicose veins, congestive heart failure, a previous myocardial infarction, obesity, pregnancy, use of oral contraceptive pills, cerebrovascular accidents, malignancies. Well, quite rarely you get severe thrombocytopenia, that is thrombocythemia, paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, and APLA, that is your antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. These are all the acquired causes for venous thromboembolism. When we come into the other hand, inherited factors, antithrombin 3 deficiency, factor 5, that is Leiden mutation, protein C deficiency, protein S deficiency, dysfibrinogenemia, disorders of plasminogen, and hyperhomocystinemia. All these causes the inherited factors, that is risk factors for venous thromboembolism. So this is your normal anatomy of the deep venous system of the lower limb. Okay, femoral vein followed by your popliteal vein, then it divides into your posterior tibial vein and anterior tibial vein and your great saphenous vein. Okay, from here you have the popliteal vein and the femoral vein, which constitutes your deep vein thrombosis system. Okay, now what is going to happen? You consider the deep vein which is enlarged here in this picture. Okay, so this is the normal blood flow where the blood is pumping from lower part to the upper part. Okay, like this the blood goes. Now what is going to happen in deep vein thrombosis? Now your deep vein is just clogged with this thrombus. The risk factors for the thrombus formation we just now saw. Okay, so here is the thrombus. What happens at one point of time, an embolus is picked up from the big thrombus. Okay, and this embolus is going to circulate throughout your body. Where and all it is going to go, this embolus is going to block the blood vessels. Okay, it may be a major blood vessel to the heart, it may be a major blood vessel which circulates your brain or kidney, anything. Okay, or your pulmonary arteries or pulmonary veins, wherever it goes, it just blocks the blood flow. Okay, so now what is the presentation you get in deep vein thrombosis? There will be a unilateral swelling or pitting edema. See, when you compare this leg and this leg, there is a unilateral swelling or pitting edema with redness, tenderness, and presence of collateral superficial veins. Why does this collateral superficial vein occurs? because the main deep venous system is get clogged with the thrombus. So in order to prevent that, collateral develops. So presence of collateral superficial veins are seen, tenderness is seen, redness is seen, swelling or pitting pedal edema is seen. Now, what are all the clinical signs you can demonstrate? What is Homan sign? It is the tenderness during passive dorsiflexion of the foot. It is contraindicated nowadays due to the risk of thrombus detachment or chances of embolization. Then what is Moses sign? It is tenderness on touching the calf muscle. What is Pratt sign? It is squeezing of posterior calf which elicits pain. But all these things are obsolete nowadays because there are always risk for thrombus detachment and formation of embolization. Now, what are all the clinical presentations of pulmonary embolism? So now when this thrombus is going to ascend through your pulmonary system, what happens? There is sudden onset of dyspnea or deterioration of existing dyspnea. Then comes your chest pain. Okay. So when in this picture, can you see the femoral vein here is clogged with blood clot. Now, when it is going to ascend like this, the embolism, it enters the inferior vena cava and then enters the pulmonary circulation. Okay, here comes the problem. So, there is sudden onset of dyspnea, deterioration of existing dyspnea, chest pain, sometimes syncope or dizziness due to hypotension or shock. Very common presentation is hemoptysis. Then comes your tachypnea and tachycardia, increase in respiratory rate and increase in your heart rate. Now, in the second picture, when you see the embolism here travels up through the inferior vena cava, it enters the heart as well as the lung. So, here comes your pulmonary thromboembolism. Okay, pulmonary thromboembolism. So now what are all the differential diagnosis when you see deep venous thrombosis and pulmonary embolism? So first differential will be a cellulitis. Always cellulitis will mimic the deep venous thrombosis. Next comes your ruptured Baker cyst. Next comes your calf muscle tear due to local injury. Next comes your lymphangitis or lymphedema. Next is your varicose veins. Last is your superficial thrombophlebitis. Okay. So first and foremost differential diagnosis for DVT would be cellulitis. When you come to the other hand of pulmonary embolism, you have this acute myocardial infarction as the first differential diagnosis because it just mimics dyspnea, tachycardia, tachypnea, followed by chest pain. Okay. So this typically mimics the pulmonary embolism. So first differential diagnosis will be acute myocardial infarction. Next is your pericardial tamponade. Third is your aortic dissection. So there is a grading system for deep venous thrombosis. Okay, that is called as Wells score. This is very important for your clinical examination also. So what and all you are going to assess through your Wells scoring. First is your active cancer. Any history of active cancer, you give 1 mark. If there is a paralysis or paresis or the recent plaster immobilization of the lower extremities, you give 1 mark. Recently bedridden for 3 days or major surgery within the last 12 weeks, you give 1. Localized tenderness along the deep venous system, again 1 mark. Entire leg swollen, 1 mark. Calf muscle more than 3 centimeter larger, you give 1 mark. Pitting edema confined to the symptomatic leg. Collateral specific veins, previously documented deep venous thrombosis, and any other alternative diagnostic at least as likely as DVT. So you have to -2. Okay, any alternative diagnosis at least as likely as DVT. So total score you put. There is clinical probability of DVT if the score is less than 2 or unlikely it is more than 2. So you just know that revised Geneva scoring system is also there for DVT. Now, what are all the clinical implications? That is, investigations you want to rule out. D dimer is very, very, very specific, highly sensitive, but it has a negative predictive value, low specificity, because it may be elevated in case of trauma, recent surgery, hemorrhage, cancer, and sepsis. So D dimer is not so specific, but it is highly sensitive. Clinical decision rules. You have to put a Wells DVT score and revised Geneva score. With negative D dimer rules out venous thromboembolism. All patients with a positive D dimer assay requires a diagnostic imaging study. And for patients older than 50 years of age, adjusted D dimer threshold is defined as patient age into 10 micrograms per liter. This is a rough calculation that this patient can have how much of D dimer in their body as normal values. Okay. So D dimer is highly sensitive but less specific because it may be also elevated in case of a trauma, recent surgery, hemorrhage, cancer, and sepsis. There is another thing called as compression ultrasonography, CUS. It is CUS replaced contrast venography as the preferred method for diagnosis of DVT. So the whole leg CUS you do from the groin to the calf. Limited 2-point CUS, only the popliteal and the femoral vein you will trace. So the whole leg and limited compression ultrasonography are considered equivalent since large management study shows both approaches to yield false negative results less than 1%. So they are preferred much. The diagnosis of pelvic or IVC DVT is challenging with CUS and hence a CT or MRV is considered. So it is quite difficult to trace the pelvic or the inferior vena cava DVTs. So you prefer a CT scan or an MR venogram, magnetic resonance venogram in this case. So when you do a CT scan, you can see here there is bilateral thrombus. Okay. Next important investigation is your ECG. So what can you see in ECG? The classic S1, Q3, T3 pattern. What does that mean? You can see a S wave here in lead 1. Okay. I told you anything following your R wave is an S wave. So you can see a deep S wave here. So S1, okay. Q3, in lead 3 you can see a deep Q wave. So anything following a P wave which is negative is Q. So here comes your Q wave, okay, and there is T inversion in again lead 3. Okay, so the classic S1 Q3 T3 pattern is present only in 10% of pulmonary embolism cases. Okay, so you cannot see that much ECGs with a patient of pulmonary embolism. You can just see non-specific sinus tachycardia. Okay, that is the most common presentation of pulmonary embolism. S1, Q3, T3 is seen only in 10% of positive cases. Next common finding is your right bundle branch block. When the heart pumping capacity goes, right heart failure comes, right atrium is swollen, you get a P pulmonale and you get a right axis deviation. So here you can see a wedge-shaped opacity here. There is a wedge-shaped opacity. Okay. So there is a pulmonary infarct in the right lobe, right lower lobe. What are all the other chest X-ray finding you can see? Here you can see they have marked pulmonary opacities. Any size or shape, rarely lobar or segmental, can cavitate. Here comes your wedge-shaped opacity. Okay. Here comes your horizontal linear opacities. Sometimes, very rarely, you get a pleural effusion. Okay. When you have a block here, your left lung is collapsed. When you get a left lung collapse, your diaphragm is pushed up. So you get a elevated diaphragm. Okay. And you have a enlarged pulmonary artery. Okay. Then oligemia of the lung fields, because the blood supply is lost here due to the thrombus. You can see a oligemia, that is blood flow is less. These are all the other changes of pulmonary embolism in an X-ray. Now, is there any other finding or with an image you can find out the pulmonary embolism? CT pulmonary angiography, they call in short as CTPA. Okay, CTPA. Okay, CT scan of pulmonary arteries. Okay, then you have the ventilation perfusion lung scintigraphy, something called as VQ scan. Okay, you just know these things are done. Okay, nothing much in detail. Then you have this transthoracic eso transthoracic esography, echography. Okay, you can able to see the right ventricle here, left ventricle. Okay, where you have the right atrial enlargement is seen here. Okay, through your esophagus you do the echocardiogram, that is called as transthoracic echocardiogram, TTE. So CTPA, CT pulmonary angiography, has replaced the VQ scan. VQ scan has a role when CTPA is contraindicated because of several renal insufficiency or any allergy to the contrast medium. And it can be considered in pregnant women and young women to reduce the radiation exposure to the breast. So these are all the indications where VQ scan is preferred with CTPA. In hemodynamically unstable patients with suspected pulmonary embolism who require a rapid diagnosis and cannot undergo CTPA, a bedside transthoracic echocardiogram can be used to disclose the signs of RV dysfunction. And now, how are you going to manage these cases when you have confirmed the diagnosis of venous thromboembolism? So, anticoagulation therapy is the mainstay for the treatment of thromboembolism. Acute phase, first 5 to 10 days. Maintenance phase, you give up to 3 to 6 months. Extended phase, you give beyond 6 months. Okay. So, what are all the anticoagulation of choices? Heparin. In heparin, you have unfractionalized heparin and low molecular weight heparin. Then you have parenteral factor 10A inhibitor, that is Fondaparinux. You have oral factor 10A inhibitor such as rivaroxaban, apixaban, and edoxaban. Then you have direct oral thrombin inhibitor. You have this dabigatran and vitamin K antagonist such as warfarin. So this tablet column gives as a nutshell of all the IV as well as oral anticoagulation of choices. Okay. Unfractionalized heparin, which is very most commonly used. It is used as IV as well as subcutaneously. Okay. Whereas low molecular weight heparin is given as subcutaneously and it has 80% of clearance. So it should be cautiously used in renal failure patients. When you consider this Fondaparinux, it has 100% of renal clearance, so it is contraindicated in renal failure patients. Okay, whereas all other warfarin, dabigatran, rivaroxaban, apixaban, all these things can be used in renal failure patients with cautious. Okay, so they have given the maintenance treatment dose also. For an extended treatment that is more than 6 months, you can follow this. So this is a good tablet column where you can repeatedly keep seeing this tablet column so that you can know the half-life, initial treatment, and maintenance treatment. So low molecular weight heparin are preferred over unfractionalized heparin because of both superior efficacy and safety. Okay. Unfractionalized heparin needs dose adjustment based on APTT, okay, activated partial thromboplastin time, whereas weight adjusted low molecular weight heparin can be given in a fixed dose without monitoring. So this is the advantage of low molecular weight heparin over unfractionalized heparin. However, unfractionalized heparin should be used in patients undergoing thrombolysis because of its shorter half-life, ease of monitoring, and the possibility of immediately reversal with protamine sulfate. And unfractionalized heparin is also preferred in severe renal impairment. Whereas when you see here, low molecular weight heparin has 80% of renal clearance, hence it should not be used in renal failure patients. Whereas unfractionalized heparin can be used in renal failure patients also. Okay. So in patients with suspected or confirmed HIT, HIT means heparin induced thrombocytopenia. One important complication you get because of long-term use of heparin is heparin induced thrombocytopenia. So heparin should be stopped immediately. Anticoagulation continued with other parental anticoagulants like fondaparinux. At least 5 days overlap with warfarin needed for heparin or fondaparinux. You discontinue when the INR, that is international normal ratio, is more than 2, and you have to maintain INR between 2 to 3 with oral anticoagulants. So over the past decade, direct oral thrombin inhibitor and factor 10A inhibitor overcome many disadvantages of warfarin. Direct oral anticoagulation have a rapid onset of action with peak levels reached within 2 to 4 hours. And its half-life is about 12 hours, which is much shorter than warfarin. Okay. They have little interaction with other medications and food and can be given on fixed dose without routine monitoring, hence greatly simplifying our treatment. Now, what is the role of thrombolysis? Thrombolysis in pulmonary embolism did not lower mortality and was associated with significantly 9% absolute increase in major bleeding, including 2% of hemorrhagic stroke. So thrombolysis should be limited to pulmonary embolism associated with hemodynamic instability. So in selected patients with iliofemoral deep vein thrombosis, endovascular techniques like catheter-directed thrombolysis can be considered. It reduces the overall incidence of post-thrombotic syndrome after 24 months. And then you have this IVC filter. So IVC filters, inferior vena cava filter, are indicated in patients who have absolute contraindications to anticoagulation, such as patients with active bleeding or with objectively confirmed recurrent pulmonary embolism, despite adequate anticoagulation treatment. Retrievable filters preferred over permanent filters. So this picture shows the IVC filter which is kept on the calf muscles, that is near your popliteal vein. Next comes your graduated elastic compression stockings. Graduated elastic compression stockings lower the risks of post-thrombotic syndromes. Many patients you will see, especially a female wearing these stockings, those who have varicose veins, because their veins will be very much enlarged or engorged with swelling of the lower limb with pitting pedal edema. So, in order to prevent that, you give a graduated elastic compression stockings. What is the prognosis? So, about 20 percentage of patients with pulmonary embolism die before the diagnosis and shortly thereafter. About 30 percentage of all patients with venous thromboembolism have a recurrence within 10 years. Post-thrombotic syndrome develops in 20 to 50 percentage of patients with DVT. Chronic thromboembolism and pulmonary hypertension complicates about 0.1 to 4 percentage. So, what are all the important take-home messages from this topic? The diagnostic workup of suspected DVT or pulmonary embolism includes sequential application of a clinical decision rule and D-dimer testing. Okay, that is number 1. Imaging and anticoagulation can be safely withheld in patients who are unlikely to have venous thromboembolism and have a normal D-dimer values. Direct oral anticoagulations are the first line treatment options for venous thromboembolism because they are associated with a low risk of bleeding than warfarin and are easier to use. We already saw the advantages and disadvantages. Use of thrombolysis should be limited to pulmonary embolism associated with hemodynamic instability. So thrombolysis should not be done if the patient is having hemodynamic instability like a cardiogenic shock or pulseless heart. Okay. Anticoagulation treatment should be continued for at least 3 months to prevent early recurrences. When venous thromboembolism is unprovoked or secondary to persistent factors, extended treatment beyond this period should be considered. That is more than 6 months, when the risk of recurrence outweighs the risk of major bleeding. Okay. So D-dimer, you have to consider. Imaging and anticoagulation are safely used unless you prove otherwise it is venous thromboembolism. Direct oral anticoagulation are the first line treatment. Use of thrombolysis should be limited. You give treatment for at least 3 months to prevent early recurrences, and you extend the duration of treatment according to the patient's requirement. Okay, so that comes to an end. So any doubt?
Thank you, sir.
So, no, you said there should be a 5-day overlap with warfarin. So, what does that mean?
Yeah, first you start heparin. Okay,
Okay,
day
sir.
1 you start with heparin. For next 5 days you give heparin. That heparin can be a unfractionalized heparin. It could be a fondaparinux. It could be a low molecular weight heparin.
Yes, sir.
Okay. In between that, on day 3, you start with oral anticoagulations like warfarin.
Okay.
Okay. So that on day 5, when you stop heparin, your oral anticoagulation takes up the treatment.
Okay, sir.
This therapy is called as bridging therapy.
Okay, sir.
Okay. That is how you monitor the patients accordingly with INR values, internationalized normal ratio.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Yeah. I'll try to upload all the PowerPoints to the representative.
Sir, about ventricular arrhythmias, sir.
Ventricular arrhythmias, I have a meeting, Kanato.
Okay,
3
sir.
o'clock already 15 minutes late. I'll try to cover some one day. Okay.
Okay, sir.